Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching The Naturalist Capitalist. I am your host, Reed Coverdale, and I've got Dave Smith back on the show again. How you doing today, Dave?
Very good. Happy to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. I was saying right before the show, and I've said on Twitter before, but I just want to say publicly on video, thank you for being willing to do this type of stuff. And it hasn't just been with me, it's been with a ton of young guys and gals in the liberty movement. And it's really cool to have somebody with a big platform who's willing to elevate people. And we all really appreciate it. This is a thanks, not just from me, but from everybody. We all really thank you for being willing to do all this stuff.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. And like I told you, off air, I live for this shit, and I love what you're doing. I love finding good young libertarians who are coming up. It inspires me. It makes me feel like optimistic about the future. And it's this stuff was done for me when I was first coming up and just building an audience. I mean, lots of guys in the libertarian space. I mean, like Tom Woods had a huge audience and I had nothing, and he kind of knighted me, and Ron Paul and like all these great libertarians really helped me out when I was first starting. And then like in the comedy world, like guys like Joe Rogan and people like that really help. So I'm happy to be able to do that. And it's kind of the right thing to do too, because it was, that was done for me by other people. So I love finding people who are coming up who are great and letting other people know about them. So my pleasure.
Yeah, awesome. Before we jump into the subject of the day, I did want to touch on libertarian unity, because that was what we did the last video on. And frankly, that video was probably the most that I've ever done for the Libertarian Party or the Libertarian movement, because I feel like it just cleared up so many misconceptions on both sides. I got dozens and dozens of messages on Twitter and Facebook from people I didn't even know. That video has like 8,000 views, which is a lot for me. And just reading the comments, there were like maybe 2 negative comments in there, but most of it was just like, wow, I'm so glad this conversation happened. And I think things are definitely better now. I mean, I'm seeing a desire for unity since you and me and other people have been trying to push for it. Don't you think it's been somewhat successful over the last few months, or what's your take?
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I think that the more that there's been a group of us who are trying to push this idea that and unity, I think to us doesn't mean conformity, or that we can't have disagreements, or that we can't argue things out, but just to try to keep perspective and being like, hey, if we live in this moment in 2021 where we're coming off a year of the government basically just shredding the Bill of Rights, and we're against the warfare state, and we're against these insane corporate bailouts, like just another $2 trillion one just got passed. Since the last time we've spoke about corporate bailouts, there's been another 2 trillion. I'm sorry, I guess only 80% of it was corporate bailouts, but over 1.5 trillion in corporate bailouts. And it's like, if we're against the genocides and the lockdowns and the corporate bailouts and the militarized police and the war on drugs, and I mean, okay, whatever other differences we have, that's a whole lot of agreement. Like, that's really important. And I think that one of the things that's been kind of like revealing for a lot of people who were either on the fence or on one camp or the other, is that when they see people making a good faith effort to come together, and then they see other people like kind of trying to shit on it and divide people again, it kind of lets people know who's where and what your motives really are. And so like I said, man, like to you guys, and I it's one of the things that I really love about you and kind of your group is that we're all on the same page here. Like, let's at least try. Let's try to work together. And to me, that's the spirit of the whole liberty unity stuff. Like, if we have any chance, if we want to have any chance, we're fighting a very difficult fight with very, damn near insurmountable odds. we got to at least be able to brush off some of this stuff and work together to some degree, or we have like no chance. So let's try.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of segues well into the topic we're going to be discussing, which is libertarian tolerance. As you just said, the idea isn't conformity or agreeing on everything. It's just realizing we're on the same side. And an issue I see in the liberty movement right now is there are a lot of people who think that you have to have the same opinion about literally everything to be a libertarian. And I'm not talking about an opinion on what the government should have control over. They think you need to think the same thing about, guns or drugs or, sexual preference, whatever. Like all of it has to be 100% acceptable to you. Where to me, libertarianism is not about accepting other people's ideologies. It's about tolerating them. And there's a difference there. The tolerating means you don't have to think what other people are doing or how they're choosing to live their lives is good. You just have to accept that it's not your right to be able to dictate how they're going to live. Do you agree with that distinction? Or
Yeah, I think that I think you're really onto something there. There was a Gene Epstein, who's one of my favorite people and one of the most brilliant libertarians out there. He said once, I believe it was on Tom Woods' show, that he said if aside from non-aggression, if there was one other value that was the most central to the whole libertarian business, it would be tolerance. Like right behind non-aggression, the next step is tolerance. And I think there was a lot of wisdom to what he was saying, that libertarianism in a sense requires tolerance. That again, like you said, that doesn't mean you have to embrace something. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with something, but you have to tolerate the idea that people are going to have different views and different lifestyles and different cultural preferences. And tolerance is something that the liberals used to talk about. Like I'm old enough to remember when that was kind of like their jam. They don't really bring that up so much anymore. And I think that if you judge on a scale of tolerance, it's pretty easy to see what side is more tolerant than the other. That's just my own, kind of perspective on it. But yeah, I pretty much agree with you. And that to me is that's my attitude, and that's the attitude that I've seen from the majority of the Mises Caucus and the people who get labeled all types of names, that nobody, like there is, if you were to post in the Mises Caucus group, or if you were to, say this at one of the meetings, if you were to say like, hey, I think, whatever the left kind of cultural preference that you could think of is, insert whatever there, I think trans women are women, or I think, trans women should be allowed to play sports against other women, or I believe, whatever you want to say. There might be some people who'd like disagree with it, but it'd be like, okay, that's your view. Maybe I agree or I disagree or something, but no one's like, oh, you got to get out of here, you're a horrible person or something like that. It's like, okay, it's not really what we're about. We're about these other issues. Whereas there's some people on the other side who I think do not tolerate deviation from their cultural preferences, and I think it's a problem in the Libertarian Party, but almost kind of minor compared to how big a problem it is at society, in our society in general. So, but yeah, I think in general we could use a lot more tolerance and a lot less demanding conformity.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are assuming that I'm only talking about left-wing issues, but I'm really not. I've got a very good friend, Eric Jackman, who worked on both of Ron Paul's campaigns, worked on Rand Paul's campaign, and he absolutely hates guns. Like, he despises them, and he would never, ever own a gun. But he is a staunch defender of the Second Amendment. He realizes it's not my place to say other people can't own guns. So a lot of people would think that, this could only be for issues about transgender women playing sports or something. This really goes both ways. If you're someone who is extremely liberal, who only eats granola and, doesn't drive diesel cars or trucks or anything and doesn't want to touch guns, you can be a libertarian. That's completely fine. You don't
Absolutely.
have to give in to the right-wing culture parts of libertarianism either. And I think a lot of people kind of forget that.
Oh yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And in addition to that, I think it's not as if the right wing is a bastion of tolerance themselves. I mean,
Right.
I think, and I've been talking about this a bit lately, and I've said this for years, really, but specifically lately, I've been talking about it. But it's like a lot of times, I think the right wing in America today comes off as more, well, certainly as more anti-establishment, in some cases more pro-liberty, in some cases more pro-tolerance, but a lot of that's just because they're losing. I mean,
Right.
it's like the loser always asks for peace. Like if you're on the ground and someone's got a gun over your head, it's like, yeah, you start thinking murder is immoral pretty quickly, but the real test is when you have the gun, like how you feel about murder. And so look, to me, like the last time the right wing really had some control over the culture was in the post 9/11 era, and they were incredibly intolerant of anybody who, try being a Ron Paul libertarian in the year 2005. That was a time, I mean, that's before I was in, but this was a time when you were basically, they would accuse you of being with the terrorists. This was if you questioned the war in Iraq, you were against the troops and all of this stuff. So it's not, there's plenty of intolerance to go around. It's just at the moment, the progressive kind of corporate woke culture is what's in control of pretty much everything, and so of course they are incentivized to be the least tolerant. But I agree with you, it's not a left-right issue inherently.
Yeah, I think that's something that you talk about a lot. That's really true. Because I actually remember in 2003, my parents were both Republicans. They both voted for George Bush, but they were against the war in Iraq. And we were standing on the side of the road, all seven of us, all five of us kids with my mom and dad, and we had cardboard signs that said like bombs kill kids, no war, it's not worth it or whatever. And this conservative talk show host was driving by, and so he stopped and he got out and talked to my dad, and he said, "Hey, why don't you come on my show?" So my dad went on his show, over the phone, and he was grilling him because he thought my dad was like a crazy progressive leftist or something who didn't think we should have a military or and he found out my dad is actually more conservative than he was. But he was just so reactionary to the fact that he was against the war that it just blinded him to everything else. So you're totally right that this isn't really anything new. I just feel like the left is way better at it, almost like they're better at this cancel culture shit. They're better at this cultural crap, and they've chosen issues that are objectively easier to get behind. Like it's easier to get behind being against racism, even though they take it way too far and they use it where that's not really the issue at hand anymore. But if you look at the things that the right was canceling people over, it was canceling them over like using drugs for medicinal purposes or being against wars or questioning religious ideology. The things that the left has chosen to embrace on their objective value, they're a lot harder to fight against. You know what I mean?
Sure, but I mean, look, when the right wing was being somewhat effective with it, it was being against terrorism, which is a pretty easy thing to be against.
Right.
Also, it's again, it's all kind of in how you frame it. I mean, I think that this modern incarnation of intolerance and cancel culture or whatever, which also isn't new. I mean, it's just this is the newest form of
Right.
cancel culture. We kind of had a somewhat wild west free internet, and I mean that in the best of the in the best sense of the term, for a few years, and now that's kind of being rolled back. And so now it feels like, oh my God, there's this cancel culture thing. But I mean, try being a anti-war activist during World War I, and you were getting a lot worse than banned from Twitter. You might end up in an insane asylum or something, or in prison or something like that. So there, but the reason why this latest incarnation is extremely effective is because there is a dominant control of every cultural institution and political institution. I mean, if you have all of the, I mean, all of the, schools, not even just universities. I mean, K through 12, all of the universities, all of Hollywood, all of the corporate press, all of the politicians, all of the social media, companies. I mean, that's quite a monopoly on ideas. And so that's why this stuff, I think, spreads so, effectively. I mean, like propaganda works, and that's why it's persisted for, a very long time. It works.
Yeah. I think it's something else that you point out is it's kind of the same interest group that has been behind it, whether it's on the right or the left, and they just know which targets to go after that just distract everybody from the actual issues. So it's always about corporate and warmongering power, but they've hijacked both the right in the past and the left now to shut down any dissenting voices in the name of either national security or wokeism. Do you want to kind of dive into that, explain what you mean? Because I totally agree with you, but just so the audience has a better idea what you're talking about.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that if you look at it like this, like what is wokeism really? And what it really is kind of the cultural version, the popularized, corporatized, dumbed down version of critical theory, right? And that's particularly critical race theory, right? Which is something that's been in the universities for decades. Has, it's been at least had some success in the universities at least since the 80s, but it really goes back to like the Frankfurt School. But these ideas have been around since the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and they made some, they gained some more power little by little through that time. But what you saw, right, like that the ideas now that are out there that would have just been laughed at 15 years ago. I mean, they might still be laughed at now, but they also might happen, like whatever, like, oh, I think that Mr. and Mr. Potato Head is problematic or something like that. Or the idea that I think that, like whatever, silly woke issue you could think of, right. Someone had a Halloween party where they were in an offensive costume, and so someone has to be fired because they didn't condemn them hard enough. This stuff would have been laughed out of the room 15 years ago. So the real question becomes, what changed? What changed from then to now? And that it's not the ideas in academia, like that's not really what changed. What changed is that all of the biggest giant corporations, all of the politicians and the deep state, the military, the Federal Reserve, the corporate press, they all jumped on board the woke train. And I think this is pretty impossible to deny. Right. Like, look at any of them, right? They're all on board with the woke shit. All of them. I mean, they're all like, all they talk about all day long are all of the woke issues, systemic racism and all of this shit. I mean, it's the number of mentions, you see those nexus charts, the number of mentions of social justice and racism and toxic masculinity and, whatever, all the dumb terms. I mean, they just skyrocketed in the Washington Post and the New York Times. People are inundated with this stuff. And this is what kind of led to this culture. It really wasn't so much that there was like a bottom-up movement. It's not that there was some demand from the people to start routing out racism, like in a large sense, maybe a very small percentage of the population, but not like really. And it's not that racism got much worse after 2010 in the country. It's, like there wasn't some uptick in like fucking any measurable sense of that. What happened was you had these two like very dangerous from the establishment's perspective, populist movements, one from the left and one from the right. And there was the Tea Party movement on the right, and there was the Occupy movement on the left. And both of these movements were seen as very, very dangerous from the establishment's perspective, because they were different than movements in the past, where they weren't like, hey, we hate your guy, we want our guy in. These were movements that were much more likely to say, we think all the guys are corrupt. We think your guy and our guy is corrupt. We don't really like any of them. I mean, the Occupy movement happened under Barack Obama. It's not like they were protesting a Republican president. They were like fed up with the whole system. And they're standing outside the big banks and screaming, we are the 99%. I mean, you want to freak out the establishment. That's how you do it. And in some way, from the libertarian perspective, right? Can't we almost see that the Tea Party, and I said it like this on my show the other day, it's like that the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street almost had two parts to this like locket that was supposed to go together. And like, oh, you could realize you're like, one of them's like, we really hate big government, and the other one's like, we really hate these big corporations. And like, how long before you go like, well, who bailed out those big banks that you're, protesting? It's like, oh yeah, the government did. Oh, huh. So you're kind of against this too. Oh, and we're kind of against that too. And I mean, they weren't inherently opposed to each other. And after, it really is right on the heels of Occupy Wall Street that you see this move being made, that all the corporate press wants to talk about is the social issues. And here's what we really, really need to focus on. It's white male privilege. That's really the most important issue. And you see them jump on it. I mean, the very banks that they were protesting are now blatantly pandering to the left. As you know, someone tweeted out that picture the other day of like, I think it was JP Morgan Chase with their like, gay pride float or whatever. It's like, this is their thing. Hey, look, we will gladly send all of our white and Jewish executives to diversity training. We're happy to do that. No problem. Like that is what we're willing to give you. And as Scott Horton brilliantly pointed out, it's not even, they don't even have to give you anything of substance. Like they don't even have to say, oh, and we're also going to lobby for like some criminal justice reform or something like that. Cause it's like, I guess JP Morgan probably has a little bit more influence with the government than me or you. So we'll use this little bit of influence that we have to try to give you something. No, it's none of that. It's just like we're attacking, whatever. So someone posted, sent me the other day that Lockheed Martin had some ad about how, inclusive of transgender people who work there. I mean, it's like, it's really, once you start really looking at it objectively, it's kind of obvious what's going on here. This is their ploy to throw people off of the scent, and it's worked remarkably well. That it's really got people focused on all of these silly issues, and I got to say, it's kind of deeply saddening and really surprising to me that some libertarians have fallen for this bait, because I really would have thought that the mix of two things that would have just inoculated libertarians against any of this silliness would be, number one, I mean, I think libertarians probably have a few IQ points on the general population. I mean, you have to have some degree of critical thinking and, to kind of get to this place. You're not just, I mean, typically speaking, you're not just falling in line to become a libertarian. You kind of figured something out for yourself, like you're not just like, oh, well, I live in a libertarian state, so I vote libertarian because we don't have any states. So, typically you kind of read a book or thought things through, so there's the thinking part, but also just that libertarians are so focused on these issues that really matter. Like we're focused on war and slavery and, incarceration and taxation and, just like these things of like these people who are raping the average person. So how could you get distracted? I said this the other day. I tweeted something about this. I go, how could libertarians get distracted over like transphobia when we've got genocides going on? And immediately I get libertarians who are like, well, transphobia is this really huge problem. And then people start like twisting it. And it's like, oh, so you're against trans rights. And it's like, oh, come on, man. Like I'm talking about fighting whether everybody has warm, fuzzy feelings about other people. I mean, like, this is like, how could you prioritize this over the stuff that we know about? And then specifically, and I feel this way about the left too, but particularly with libertarians, but specifically when you see, CNN and JP Morgan Chase and the New York Times pushing all this stuff, doesn't that make your eyebrow raise up a little bit? Like, doesn't that at least make you go like, hey, wait a minute. Like you're not doing this because you have so much empathy. Like, you're not doing this because you care about people so much, Raytheon. You know what I mean? Like, so it's really been, I think it's kind of obvious what's going on, really. And the more I talk about it and dive into it, it's like the more obvious it becomes to me. But I just can't believe that so many people have fallen for it. This is it. It's just like the progressive era, man. It's a corporate plot. And that's not to say that it didn't start from intellectuals. It did. But this was a corporate plot to take this over and use this to pit us into a culture war, to distract the left from the issues they really care about, and force the right, which they kind of know by their very nature are just reactionary. And so this is the perfect thing to get them to react against. And now here we are fighting each other while they rape all of us.
Yeah, something that really stuck out to me that you just said was that they don't even have to do anything of substance. That is so true. I did go to one of the rallies last summer in Denver just to see what was going on. And I ended up making a sign that said end qualified immunity, end civil asset forfeiture, demilitarize the police, because those are like actual issues with the way the policing is done in America. So I went around and I talked to like 100 people. I kind of felt like Peter Schiff at the Occupy Wall Street thing. I was trying to bring some sense to it or whatever. But I talked to like 100 people, and I think 2 of them knew what qualified immunity was. I don't think any of them knew what civil asset forfeiture was. And they're all there screaming, no justice, no peace. And my opinion was, okay, if you want justice to have peace, you kind of have to know what justice means. Like what are you expecting out of this? But everyone I talked to, they were voting for Biden, and I don't think Harris had been chosen yet. But the fact that you're voting for the guy who wrote the 94 crime bill because of some virtue signaling, when you're out here protesting, you're protesting the results of everything that man has done in office. It just goes to prove your point that they don't have to do anything. They can even be the opposite. They can be the exact opposite of what these people say they want, as long as they use the right language, and they totally fall for it.
No, it's become the woke stuff has really just led to movements based around gestures. And gestures seem to be all that anyone needs to be bought off. And I'll tell you, this is like one of the things that was so frustrating to me during the presidential campaign. I remember when, Joe Jorgensen first had that tweet, the infamous tweet. And the Libertarian Party Twitter account was trying to do like damage control. And they said at one point, they go, look, we support the movement, not the organization. Like, that was the big line that they all decided on. And they had a tweet where they said, supporting Black Lives Matter, the movement, means supporting ending qualified immunity, ending the war on drugs, ending all of this and these policies. And I remember feeling right away, like, you're like, yeah, but dude, that's just not really living in reality. To say that that's what the movement was all about. I mean, you're really putting a libertarian wish on top of a libertarian stretch to think that that's what the movement was about. I mean, like, that rarely came up. Most of the people protesting don't even know what that is. Most Americans don't know what qualified immunity is. Most Americans don't know what civil asset forfeiture is. They're both really horrible and should be repealed. But let's not. It's like if you say, Donald Trump says drain the swamp, and I were to say what drain the swamp means is audit the Federal Reserve.
Right.
It's like, well, that's a nice thought. I mean, I wish that's what it meant, but that's really not what it means. And let's not pretend that that's what MAGA means, end the Fed. Like, well, no, it doesn't. And I wish it did, but it certainly doesn't. And if it did, I'd get on board with it, but it doesn't. So I won't. And like, no, to me, like, you couldn't. To ignore this just seems to be like living in a fantasy land. But Black Lives Matter was had a lot to do with race. I mean, it's right in the name. Yeah. And that's like, it wasn't just about police brutality. It was specifically about police brutality toward Black people. And that right. So there's a whole racial narrative that you had to be buying into. And Spike Cohen, who I like very much, but he said to me on my show during the campaign that he goes, well, look, I can't go to these meetings and tell them it's not about the racism, it's about the statism, or then they won't hear what I have to say. And I was like, okay, maybe you're right about that. But that's the truth. That is the truth. It's really not about racism. It's about statism. And
Right.
there would be, I just the other day I was watching again because I guess the trial's about to begin. I was watching the George Floyd body cam tape. And I mean, it's horrible. The whole thing is just so tragic. It's just fucking horrible. And I think from a libertarian perspective, when you watch it, you just see all the problems with state policing. There's no like incentive structure to de-escalate the situation.
Right.
All of the incentives line up to like, I have to force compliance out of this guy. So this guy is freaking out. He's on drugs, clearly. He's a mess. He's crying, he's screaming, he's hysterical. And right away they're like, out of the car, on your back, on this. And it's all about like enforcing their will on this other guy. And no one is making an attempt to do what any private organization that was actually responsible to their customers would be doing right away, which is let's try to de-escalate the situation. Like no one is talking to him and be like, hey, buddy, like just breathe, relax. Everything's going to be okay. We're going to take care of you. I understand. Listen, whatever it would be in a private society, be like, listen, I can't let you drive off. Like we're going to put you in an Uber on your way home. You're going to get something in the mail about using a counterfeit, note or something like that. But there's just no need to be like forcing and to have someone in cuffs and put him on the ground and put your knee on the neck. It's absolutely outrageous. And there should be consequences for that. Like it's horrible, but there's no indication that this was a racist thing. Like there's just not. I don't think that if some big white dude was tweaked out on drugs and acted the same way, the cops would have been like, on your way, sir, high five. Like they would have reacted the exact same way, I think. And so it's just like you're having this whole movement and everything becomes based around race when I just don't really see the evidence. And like I'm open to evidence if someone were to point it to me, but I don't really see evidence that this was a racist attack. And so if you can't talk about that and the whole thing is race obsessed, you're going to have some trouble. But again, like to me, like this is it's the mentality that is intentionally pushed on people to be race obsessed, to be sexual preference obsessed, gender obsessed, all of these things. You have to look at these things as like right at the forefront of everything. And to me, I think that the true message of, if you want to call it anti-racism or just being as not racist as you can be, the best message of the civil rights movement and things like that are that race really shouldn't be that important of an issue. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, but it really just shouldn't be that important. If someone's, you should judge them as an individual, or you should, like that you should judge them based on their own merit, on their own values, on their own qualities, and that race shouldn't be the first thing that we think about. And that's kind of like how I feel in general in life. I don't, like I'm a stand-up comic and I'm a libertarian. And to me, like both those games are extremely individualist games. You judge people by their contributions, their merits. You punish them by their crimes, not others. And like, like as a stand-up comic, like none of us ever were like, oh, man, Dave Chappelle's such a good black comic. You know what I mean? It's just fucking Dave Chappelle. He's just the best. No one cares. Yeah. It's just about how hard I'm laughing. Like it doesn't matter what color or fucking what gender or anything like that you are. And so it's hard. It's hard to deal with these movements that are obsessed with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just more of the throwing off the scent. I mean, just like they used it to gain favor for their issues, whether it's whether it's Raytheon putting out that ad or JP Morgan Chase with the float. It's also used to distract from where there is a problem. Like everyone knows there's a problem with policing. But if you can just scream racism, then you just get these omnibus bills from the Republicans and Democrats that do nothing to address the specific issues. Like Justin Amash and Rand Paul had great, like 3-page bills to end qualified immunity, end no-knock raids, end civil asset forfeiture. They got no publicity at all. But if you can, kneel on the floor of the House with some African robe around your neck or something, then you really get people's attention, and then they really think you mean business and that you're gonna fix everything.
well, think about it like this, right? And because I know even when I say the shit about wokeism being a corporate plot and all that, I know there'll always be a few people who give me some pushback, who are like, oh, well, it doesn't have to be this conspiracy. You know, it could just be that this is all these corporations are doing this because they think that this is the profitable thing to do or whatever. And like, oh, okay, you know, on its face, that is possible. But you got to think about something like this, right? Like the idea, at least I think for most libertarians, the idea that, you know, I mean, I'm not talking about mom and pop shops here. I'm talking about Raytheon, JP Morgan Chase, the New York Times, and the CIA, for God's sakes. Okay. So the idea that they couldn't be conspiring together, like, I don't think that should be dismissed so quickly. But just think about it like this, right? Like the George Floyd thing kind of got picked. I mean, there are incidents like this all the time.
Right.
Why was it like before it had even turned into like a huge national movement? Why is it that it was everywhere, that the entire corporate press apparatus decided this story will be talked about all day, every single day? And from the libertarian perspective, doesn't it seem just like a little bit coincidental that this came 3 months after the government repealed the Bill of Rights and decided to lock everyone in their homes and decided in that moment to start raping everybody and giving all of their money to giant corporations and print $2 trillion and bail out all the banks again? You know, the last time they bailed out the banks, they had an Occupy Wall Street movement on their hands. And this time they bailed out the banks, and it's like, oh, we better focus on this. And then, you know, like, look, I understand you can make an argument about the disproportionate, you know, like numbers and stuff like that. I'm not dismissing any of that, but just aside, you know, about twice as many white people are killed by cops every year as black people. So how come we don't hear twice as many stories about that? I mean, just saying, you would think if something happens twice as much, you would hear about it about twice as much or somewhere in that ballpark. Why is it that, what was his name? Dylan Shaver. Why is that not a national story? I mean, here you have this guy crying on his hands and knees, begging for his life, executed by a cop. I mean, that's way more egregious than what happened to Floyd. I mean, not that one's not horrible too, but like, you know, you put your knee on somebody's neck, you know, 99.9 times out of 100, that doesn't end up killing the guy, but you shoot someone style. That's like, whoa, you fucking murdered this guy in cold blood. So why isn't that a national outrage? Because I'm just saying it this way, is that if you saw, let's say both those stories are national stories, well, now all of a sudden we're not thinking about a racial issue. We're thinking about a police versus citizen issue, a state versus citizen issue. And if you're thinking about that, then logically right away you go to the power of the state. Why do the cops have this power? Why are they not prosecuted the same way that any other person would be? Why shouldn't they be even more responsible since they're entrusted with this duty and paid with our tax dollars? But we don't have those stories all get the same type of attention, and then they make it a racial narrative. And now the focus is on how racist the country is. This kind of boogeyman, which is it's and this is right out of critical race theory, which is like the most infuriating thing about it, is that it's the most anti-libertarian, you know, philosophy you could imagine, because it's completely against individuals and everything is societal. Everything is the societal structures. So now you're kind of fighting this ghost. Like, we want to end systemic oppression. Not this guy did something to this guy or this organization is guilty, but society. And now we have to go ghost hunting for any impure thought that a white person has in their head. And let's talk about Aunt Jemima, and let's talk about, you know, the wage disparities and all these other, and we're talking about everything except the issues that matter, which are, as you said, like the 5 things that Rand Paul or Justin Amash would introduce in their bills. Like, here's these 5 things that could pretty much make everything better. Short of privatizing the police in general, here are the 5 things that could really make it so much better. You know, and it's like pretty simple. End the war on drugs, end qualified immunity, end civil asset forfeiture, end policing for profit, like, you know, just down the list, like really common sense things. But despite this huge movement, all of those issues get very little traction. Like, and that's the thing that libertarians should wake up to. I mean, you had this huge movement, and who is talking about any of these important issues? That they're almost not even on the radar. What we're talking about is like, will there be, you know, a black district attorney? Let's make sure it's a black woman of color, you know, or a woman of color, or something like that. That's it.
Yeah. And it's weird. Like when you and I point out things like this, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, you don't care about racism. You don't believe in gay rights. You don't believe in transgender rights." My older sister's gay. You know, I absolutely hate racism. I've worked with transgender people. It's not about the transgender issue or the race issue or the gay issue. It's the fact that you're falling for it that's so
Yeah.
hilarious and infuriating. You know, like that. I shared that picture from Raytheon on Instagram, and I said, "Wow, I'm so glad Raytheon's woke." And a bunch of the reactions were like, "Why do you care who works at Raytheon?" And I'm like, "No, no, no, no. You're missing the point. It's why do you care who works at Raytheon? The point is it's Raytheon and they're making bombs
Yeah,
and fueling the, you know, yeah, go
and
ahead."
I'll say I had some reactions from the other side that were pissing me off too. Like I shared that thing, and then I almost had some people like I forget what I said exactly, but I made some joke about it, and then I almost had some people like laughing, like they were like, "Ah, yeah, ha ha, they. Why are we going to call one person they or something like that?" And I'm like, no, dude, the joke isn't that there's a transgender person.
Right.
Like the joke, that's not the butt of the joke. The joke is that this is fucking Raytheon who builds bombs to fucking incinerate babies, and that they think that, oh, they're like some noble, inclusive people because they stamped a trans person on their little flyer. That's the joke. So people on both the right and the left, like even the right and left ends of libertarianism, completely miss the fucking point of this, which is
Yeah.
frustrating. But it's like, yeah, no, dude, that's the issue here. It's not about, and it's sometimes it's challenging because it's so, and I think people really are trained in a way, because it's really weird when you see it. But they're almost trained to start making these assumptions if you start having the conversation we're having, which if you were trying to propagandize people would really be what you'd want. That even as soon as you start having these conversations, it's like they're not responding to what you say. They're assuming that you must be saying this because you really hate people and you're a racist on some level, right? Like it's
Right.
almost like these little like unspoken triggers that go, oh, okay, well, he's saying this because of this. And like you said, I mean, I don't hate any group of people, and I don't like my feelings about like transgender people, or like, I mean, I have no idea what it must be like to be a transgender person. And I don't know. I don't even care whatever your views on transgender people are. Like, if you believe that it is absolutely a biological fact that that person was born with the brain, as some people have made the argument that they actually have the brain of the opposite sex, and that this is like, you know, they'll only be whole if they have some type of gender reassignment surgery, or you believe that they're suffering with a mental illness and that they're you know, it's like a delusion and they had childhood trauma. I mean, either way, that's a really tough thing to be going through, and I have no idea what it's like to be that. I don't know. I can't imagine what it would be like to grow up under either of those circumstances. So I have nothing but sympathy for those people, and I hope their lives are as easy and you know, as possible under the circumstances. And I think that the truth is, I mean, if you want to talk about like racism and things like that, I mean, I don't know. I'm from Brooklyn. I've grown up around a lot of every race you could think of. I mean, literally every race you could think of. I've grown up around, and
Yeah.
I think truthfully that the whole topic of racism almost like starts to miss the point. Like, because to me, I think the term racism gets thrown around all the time, and it's very ill-defined. It's not specific. You know, it's like I kind of subscribe to like the Avenue Q, you know, philosophy. I think everybody is a little bit racist. I don't think anyone is completely pure of having no, you know, prejudices at all, even if somewhat subconscious. You know what I mean?
Right.
And the people who claim they are and claim to be the champions of anti-racism often end up being like some
Pretty
of the
racist.
more racist people, you know, that I know. But the reality is that what thoughts you have, or what jokes you make, or what even like comments somebody makes, even really shitty comments, are just not the most important thing. And here's what is the most important thing, right? Is that we live in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, or right there, right up there. I mean, overall as a country, the wealthiest by far. And there are pockets in this country that are basically third world countries, and they're disproportionately not white. Okay.
Right.
And like not all of them. There are some real poor areas that are white, but like you draw, me and Jay Okerson is like a great comedian, is one of my best friends. And me and him used to do gigs in Philly, and we would drive through Camden on our way back. And we would drive through like late at night, like 2-3 in the morning on our way back from shows, coming back to New York from shows in Philly. And we would almost do it like just for the experience of driving through Camden at 3 in the morning. And you drive through Camden, it's like you leave Philadelphia, this big city with all this stuff going on, and 5 minutes later, you're not in America anymore. Like I'm talking about like you'll go down a block where 4 houses in a row are just boarded up because they've been condemned by the city. The next house has a whole bunch of people just doing drugs on it. I remember this one time particularly, this always stuck out to me, but it's like 3 in the morning. There's a 3-year-old walking down the street with no shoes on, just in the middle of this chaos. And I mean, it's like an area where like if the car broke down, you'd be scared for your life. Like we may not get out of here alive, and I mean, like that's a 3-year-old. Like I have a 2-year-old at home. Like that some other 2-year-old out there, some other perfect 2-year-old is living through that. Like that's what matters. How can we help them? That's
Right.
what fucking matters. It doesn't matter like what someone said or a comment or a view or whether someone like brought up some point that you think is wrong, that you think is offensive. All of this is like superficial, upper middle class white people values. Now, I decided the value is what makes me feel uncomfortable. I decided the value is someone tweeted an offensive tweet a couple years ago. I don't care about that shit at all. I care about that 3-year-old in Camden with no shoes. Like, what can we do for that kid? That I'm all ears for that conversation. The conversation over like, but Hotep Jesus tweeted about Jewish power 2 years ago. Like, I don't care about that. It just doesn't do anything for me. So that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's kind of concerning to me that some libertarians are giving into the thought crime bullshit.
Yeah.
When I really realized that thought crime is stupid, or trying to control how people think is just a dead end, is I was raised in a really religious family, and I eventually left the faith. I'm an atheist now, and it really hurt, like telling the entire family that, not so much my immediate family, but the extended family. Because you could see it in their eyes when you tell them. They're like, oh, Reed's going to burn in hell for eternity. And, it's just like, it really dug at me for a long time that they thought that. And then I came to the realization that, I can't change what they think. What matters is they still love me, and they're not going to kick me out of their house, and they're still going to, invite me over for dinner. And I can't do anything about the fact that they think I'm going to burn in hell for eternity because of what I believe. And I think that extends to things beyond religion. Like, as long as people are not going to aggress against each other, and they're not going to treat each other like shit, this whole idea that you need to somehow form a completely pure thought process, and that other people are going to police you and grade you on how pure your thought process is just bullshit.
Yeah, so what you're reminding me of is something, again, I end up in our conversations, and in lots of conversations, a lot quoting Gene Epstein, because he's just that fucking brilliant. And but I don't know if you ever saw when Gene Epstein debated Bhaskar Sankara, who is he runs Jacobian magazine. And he's like a democratic socialist, not a Bernie Sanders democratic, like a real deal democratic socialist who believes that all companies should be like worker co-ops, and that, capitalism should be outlawed, and, you can't be a boss and all that stuff. And they have this debate at the Soho Forum. It was incredible. I mean, Gene just wiped the floor with him. And it was just I highly recommend everyone check it out. It's up on YouTube. And one of the points that Gene made, and I've heard the capitalism versus socialism debates like a million times, you know, but there was this one point that Gene Epstein made, and I was sitting there in the audience watching it. This was pre-COVID when you could do stuff. And I was sitting in the audience watching it, and I remember thinking, like, holy shit, that was such an amazing point that I've never really like thought of before. And I thought about it for months. And then I realized there were so many other implications of it. But what he said to Bhaskar was he was kind of like, and I hope I don't butcher this too much, but he was kind of like, okay, so in your system, you're relying on the votes of the majority of the workers because you are a democratic socialist. But in my society, I say that any entrepreneur can do what he wants. The will of the majority be damned. So do you, Bhaskar, because here's the thing, right? It's like, so you're this like, you know, cosmopolitan, upper middle class, democratic socialist with all of these like left cultural values. So do you really want the decision of how many Qurans get produced in this country to be left up to the majority of the workers decide? Or would you want to say that a capitalist can produce Qurans if there's a customer base that wants to buy them from him? The will of the majority of the workers be damned. How much birth control should be produced? How much, you know, and you start going through all these things and you realize that, and I was like, holy shit, that's a fucking brilliant point that I never thought of exactly like that before. But what Gene was getting at is that you kind of go, well, look, there's this big disconnect, and you're a trucker. So I know you kind of get this. Like my father-in-law is a trucker and all his friends are truckers. So I'm fairly tapped into the trucker community. But you know, there's this disconnect between like these fucking like socialist, leftist, cultural leftist type and the workers who they claim to champion, who do not have their culture at all. Like the workers don't feel the same way you do. Like the working class in America will have some very different opinions about transgender issues than you guys do in your university. Do you really, you know, the workers in America like fucking Miller Lite and they like Hooters and they like football and NASCAR and a lot of them like Donald Trump also. Yeah. And, you know, and like, so there's this real disconnect here and you've got a real problem on your hands because you don't just want to empower them democratically. You also kind of want to fundamentally change them. And as I was thinking about this, I realized, you know, I think there's some libertarians who have this same problem in a different way. But the problem is that you go like, okay, well, we want everyone to be free. And we believe in the non-aggression principle. And that's like, okay. But if you give everyone their freedom, not everyone's going to have the same cultural preferences that you have. And you know what? A lot of people kind of want to live in a neighborhood full of their own type of people. And I'm not talking about in like an ethno-state capacity. I'm just saying that if you look at outside of mandatory segregation, there's just a lot of segregation in the country. There are black neighborhoods and Chinese neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods and white neighborhoods and all the now and you know, you can try to bend over backward to be like, well, it was redlining and banking policy and all this. And you're like, yeah, even when these policies are removed, a lot of people, like if just given their freedom, not everybody is going to have the same exact cultural opinions that you have. And that's the truth. And you can either accept that and try to work around the edges, try to convince people to go, hey, but don't be shitty to people. You know, you're not allowed to aggress against people, and we'd prefer you're not shitty to people. But beyond that, the idea that you're going to like go fighting through every thought crime that anyone could be guilty of committing, I think libertarians have a real problem on their hands if they're going to get into that battle, because what we believe in is actually your right to have whatever view you want to. You just can't aggress against anyone else. That's kind of it.
Yeah, it's funny. I worked one winter roofing in Denver, Colorado with a bunch of Mexican immigrants and black guys and actually a few women and, you know, like basically the most diverse group of people ever that the progressives would, you know, be fawning over.
Right.
So, but if they heard the conversations we had, oh my God, they're not quite on the same wavelength. So you're totally right there that they do not represent the mass majority of the workers. That's totally true.
Well, it's and also just minority groups in general. Like, it's not just white people who have racist, like,
Yeah.
beliefs. And in fact, I think, at least in my experience, there's probably, just in my experience, not saying this is universally true, but that middle class to upper middle class, or middle class to upper class white people are, I don't know if I'd say the least racist, but the most against the idea of being racist, like would bend over backward to not be perceived as racist. And if called racist, will be like, oh my God, no, I'm not racist. Racist is the worst thing you can ever be. Whereas, like, if I don't know if you've ever been, to like the hood and hung out with black people in projects, or hung out with like, like fucking Mexican dudes on a job or something like this. They don't even care about the accusation. They're just like very blatantly like,
No.
let me tell you, white people are like this. Chinese people are like this. The Mexicans are like that. Like, they just don't like operate in this kind of, with any of this political correct thing. And I thought that was kind of interesting when the Hotep Jesus was invited recently to speak. Hasn't done it yet, but was invited and is going to speak at a Mises Caucus event. And there are all these like people, by the way, I mean, just saying, not saying it discounts their argument itself, but it's kind of funny. All white guys, by the way, but a lot of white guys in the Libertarian Party are really outraged because he has some conspiratorial views about Jewish people, and has said some things that I certainly don't agree with, and some things that I think are just flat out silly, and other things that, like, well, there's a little bit of a point there, but he could have said it in a better way. But they're all like, like, oh my God, this is so outrageous, and you're like, dude, I don't think you guys realize, look, there are a lot of people in the black community who don't like Jews. There's a lot of people in the black community who don't like white people.
Right.
There's racism on that side too. And you know what? Here's a guy who's out there saying, I have become a libertarian. I've been reading Rothbard. I'm an anarcho-capitalist at this point. I judge people as individuals, and I don't believe in any type of, initiating violence against anyone. And they're sitting there going, yeah, but Dave, you're having a conversation with him and you're not denouncing him for his anti-Semitism. And it's like, okay, first of all, if you want someone to denounce anti-Semitism, I mean, like, can't you just get that anywhere? Doesn't everyone do that? Like, what is that really me adding anything of value to the conversation? And you're like, the thing that's so like retarded about all of it to me is that you go like, okay, so I'm a Jewish guy, right? I mean, are you really concerned that I'm an anti-Semite? Do you think I hate my family? Do you think I hate my daughter, and I hate my mother and my sister and my brother and my grandparents and my family who were slaughtered by the Nazis? Do you think like I don't care about them? Is that your accusation of me? Like, because that's just stupid and insane. And it's like, so here I am, a Jewish guy who's building a friendship with this guy, or at least kind of, like I've been on his show, he's been on my show. So should I really just come out and denounce him for that? Or should I try to build, extend an olive branch and go, okay, hey, let's talk about this. Hey, I really love this libertarian thing. Let's talk a little bit more about this. Let's like build this kind of conversation. Why would I come out and just denounce something he said? So he questioned whether the Holocaust happened once. Okay, that's stupid. It happened. It's one of the most well-documented genocides of all time. Like it definitely happened. I got family members. I know which death camps they were killed at. Like it happened. But okay. Like whatever, man. Like let's have a conversation. Why I have to persecute a guy for wrong thought? I can't go like, oh well, he's really interesting and he's got a big following, and he's got a big following amongst a group of people who we kind of traditionally have trouble reaching, and he's coming over to our ideas. So let's try to fucking bring him in and make him better on this other issue, and go like, hey, it's not even that you're completely wrong. Like, yes, there are a disproportionate amount of Jews in the media, but there's also a disproportionate amount of Jews in libertarianism. And there's also a disproportionate, and like some random Jewish dentist has nothing to do with that fucking media conglomerate. So like, what I just don't, I hate the idea of like, not only that we have to hunt down wrong thought, but we also have to denounce them. And whenever you get into this game of like, we have to hunt down the bad person and all publicly denounce them, maybe you need to look in the mirror and ask yourself, are you really fighting against the whole spirit of everything we hated about racism in the past? Or are you giving into it? Are you now a part of the kind of metaphorical lynch mob You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
is this really the same spirit as all of that shit that you're supposedly against? At least ask yourself that question.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it really is amazing. Because I think it's Tom Woods who said that it took a lot of courage to be against slavery in 1850, but it takes no courage
Yep.
to be against it today. This is so true. I mean, people act like when they're spouting off, just platitudes, that they're actually being brave. And they're actually feeding into the problem is they're actually feeding into canceling a lot of people who actually have decent messages. Like, I'm friends with Ryan Dawson, and he's
Mm-hmm.
very critical of Israel. So, and I know you've had him on your show. He's been just deemed an anti-Semite, and because of his criticisms of Israel, and no one will come to his defense because they're scared that they will also be deemed an anti-Semite. And I also saw this on Tulsi Gabbard's campaign. The Russian asset thing was whatever, but when David Duke said that he liked her, that's when everyone got really scared and backed off and didn't want to say anything good about her. Because if you are associated with any of these people, then everyone who feels like they're doing a noble thing by denouncing something that's so obviously bad that less than 1% of the country would approve of, they think they're somehow being brave and doing a good service, when they're really just feeding into the culture that is silencing a lot of voices who aren't even racist or aren't
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
supporting these ideas.
Right. And I used to, so that's a really good point. And of course, it also does not get applied equally to other people. So like nobody's ever, going like, oh, well, like, the royal family in Saudi Arabia supports Hillary Clinton. So, oh my God, this is a big scandal, right?
Right,
Like
yeah.
that's just, oh, that's politics, that's
Yeah.
completely acceptable. But David Duke supported someone. And I remember saying this a while back, when someone was bringing something up about Rothbard with David Duke, which, by the way, I just say to anybody who hears these things, go read the piece. Read the piece and read it with an open mind. Don't read it with a like, oh, I gotcha on this line. Take a breath and read it and listen to what Rothbard's saying, because it's actually a really fascinating piece, and I think he made excellent points in it. They say he was praising David Duke, and it's not true. That's not praise. It's funny because I get accused of the same things, where they'll be like, oh, you were praising this person, and it's like, if you really look back at it, I'm just not condemning them, and you take that as praise because you're expecting condemnation, because that's what you're just supposed to do. But I used to ask libertarians this question years ago, just to try to like, pry at them a little. I'd go, who's worse, David Duke or John McCain?
Yeah.
Like, who's worse? Because look, man, you can be against racism as much as you want to. I don't have a problem with that plank in the Libertarian Party platform. It says bigotry is repugnant and irrational, or whatever the exact wording is. Oh, okay, sure. Who doesn't think that? Bigotry is by its very nature irrational. That's in the definition of the word, I think,
Right.
But like, so sure, I have no problem with that. But is that worse than a violation of the non-aggression principle? Because now you've got a big problem on your hands if you're going to say that mean thoughts or mean words are worse than mass murder. And
Right.
that's what John McCain's guilty of. And David Duke might have, I don't even really know. I'm not like an expert on David Duke. I haven't read any one of his books or anything. I've read like excerpts that he's written, as some real crazy ones about Jews being shapeshifters and shit. And like, I don't know. It just makes me laugh. It's just too ridiculous to take seriously. He also has no power. So I tend to just laugh at people with ridiculous ideas who have no power. But
Right.
if you're going to say that that's worse than someone who's murdered a whole lot of people, you got a real problem on your hands as a libertarian. You really like have to think that horrendous violations of the non-aggression principle are worse than mean thoughts or mean words or even hateful words or whatever. I mean, you can't get around it. Like, that's just too contradictory to what we stand for. So that to me also is like that. I think in a lot of ways that speaks to the core of what we started with the libertarian unity thing, where it's like there has to be some type of prioritization of issues and outrage. And to me, and this has been a constant theme on my show for like years, I mean, like almost 10 years now on part of the problem. This has been a constant theme of mine that I've really talked about a lot. And this is the, like, here's my point. Like, outrage is a finite resource. We only have so much of it. There's only 24 hours in a day. You only have so much breath in your lungs. You only have so many words you can type on a keyboard. You can only be outraged about so many things. And, you got to like sleep and go to the bathroom and eat. You can't spend all day being outraged. And where the outrage is directed matters, And the truth is that I don't think anyone could question whether I'm right or wrong about this, right? But if President Joe Biden tomorrow bombed a third world country and killed 100 innocent people, maybe in Syria, maybe in Iraq, maybe in Iran, maybe in Yemen, maybe in fucking, wherever, I don't know, Somalia, pick a country. Any one of those could happen. So he bombs a country and kills 100 people. And he also got up in a press conference that day and he said, I don't think trans women are women.
Oh, yeah, which would be
we all know what the story of that day would be and where all of the outrage would go. And if you're a libertarian, you have to see that as somewhat of a problem with priorities. Now, I'm not saying you can't think that it's wrong for him to say trans women aren't women. Have whatever feelings on that you want to, but that's a problem. And that's where our cultural priorities are right now. And that's a really, 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 really big problem that 100 innocent people, and by the way, 100 non-white innocent people in a third world country, like that their lives mean less to most people than some thought crime. That's a huge issue. And we got to wake up and realize that we can't be a part of that problem. The libertarians, if we have a role here in this society, it is to focus people back on the issues that really matter. And that's why it's so frustrating to see libertarians get distracted with some of this stuff.
Yeah. So let's just close with that. You've touched on it a few times, and it's sort of what I said you sort of said it in the beginning, that when the right was dominant in the culture, things weren't much better. And I grew up hardcore in that. I was a kid in the 2000s when George Bush was president, and I grew up in a very conservative household, went to lots of extremely conservative institutions. They do the thought crime thing too. Yeah. So the mission for libertarians is really what you just said. It's bringing it back to the issues, away from the stupid cultural BS. I mean, that's really what we've got to do, right, going forward. And that's the most important mission we have.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's like that. The most important mission is to save the country. I mean, and that's I'm not like overstating it or being hyperbolic. It's like that this country is on a suicide mission right now. It's spinning out of control. And the answer to these problems is libertarianism. And I think that almost every libertarian knows that. Like we know that the answer to these incredible problems that we face is to stop doing all of the evil shit. Like what's the answer to the warfare state? Stop fighting all these wars. And what's the answer to the mass incarceration problem? Stop locking people up for bullshit. And what's the answer to corporate welfare? Stop giving billionaires welfare. Like every one of these things, like we have the answers to solve these problems. And the beautiful thing is not only that we have the truth on our side, not only that we have the serum, like not only that we have the solution for all this shit, but that it is truly Americanism that we're standing for. I mean, okay, like some of us might be on the anarchist, end of the spectrum. And I know that's what you've been flirting with lately. And I've been planted in that camp for a long time. But like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights is pretty damn good as far as I'm concerned. Like that's a pretty goddamn good place to start. But these are our founding documents. That's what we're fighting for. We have the truth on our side. We have the spirit of our nation on our side, and we have the answer to these serious problems. And then the more time that we spend, in fighting over this nonsense, over who cares if you're on the left side of the spectrum or the right side of the spectrum on this. Let's all stop. Look, I'll say this right now, and this is in some ways how me and you became friends, and in the last time I was on the show with all four of us and stuff, is that, look, man, anyone anyone in this liberty space who wants to try to shake some of this off and come together and focus on what matters, I'm with you. I got your back. Like, let's fucking do this. And anybody who doesn't, okay, best of luck doing it, in your path. I don't care what problems we've had in the past. I don't care about any of this. If me and Nick Sarwark can work together to try to solve one of these problems, let's fucking do it. Like, I'm not saying I've been perfect in the past. I know I've gotten into some of these battles and fights that I probably shouldn't have too, but let's really fucking why are we here? Why are we here? Because we care about these real issues, because these are real human beings who are suffering, whose lives are being ruined. Let's try to come together and brush some of this stuff off and deal with these really important issues. Because all this other stuff is like symptoms. It's symptoms of the central problem. And unless you solve the central problem, then we'll be fighting over Mr. Potato Head forever.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, man. Hey, everyone watching, if you follow Dave on Twitter, watch his videos. Don't just follow him on Twitter, because and same with me. If you just came over here from Dave tweeting this out, subscribe to me on YouTube. YouTube is way better than Twitter. YouTube, you can actually, really explain what your thought process is, what you mean. You don't have 240 characters, and you're not encouraged to just get in these little spats. And that's how Dave and I really became friends, being able to talk on YouTube and in long conversations through text back and forth. Twitter sucks. So, expand beyond Twitter. Try to form your opinion of someone beyond just what they say on Twitter. Dave, I just want to thank you for coming on. We'll have to do it again. I'll just give you the last word and then we'll close out.
No, dude, once again, man, I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you having me on. Anytime, man, hit me up. I'm happy to do it again. And I'd love to get you on my show as well.
All right, we'll do that. Sounds good.
Hell yeah.